Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is something in the void between stars that watches you back. Not in a metaphorical sense, not as a figure of speech drawn from some cautionary tale passed down through generations of void sailors to scare fresh recruits away from portholes during warp transit. Literally, there is something out there in the deep black between systems, drifting without apparent purpose through the cold dark of the Jericho Reach, and it has been watching longer than most civilizations have existed. Its official designation, buried inside Deathwatch librarian records filed under the highest classifications, is Warp Artifact Aleph Omicron 002. The navigators who have sensed it crossing their path, those strange mutated souls who guide vessels through the impossible geography of the warp, call it something else in the secret language they share among themselves. They call it the doom that awaits. And the people of the Jericho Reach, like the billions of ordinary souls spread across dozens of worlds who have never left their own atmosphere, but who sometimes look up at the sky and feel a cold dread they can't name. They have their own name for it too. Mortis Thuler, death from beyond the horizon. If you have heard of a space hulk before, that vast drifting category of object that appears throughout 40,000 lore, and a mass of fused and broken ships compressed together by the tides of the warp into something singular and nightmarish, then what I am about to describe will push the limits of what you thought that word could mean. Because most space hulks are dangerous in the way that a gun is dangerous. Something finite, something you can point a fleet at and solve with enough firepower. Mortis Thuler is not that kind of dangerous. Mortis Thuler is dangerous in the way that a tide is dangerous, or a geological age is dangerous. It is old in a way that resists comprehension. It is large in a way that changes the light on nearby worlds when it passes. It keeps growing. And in all the thousands of years since humanity first recorded its passage, no one has destroyed it. No one has fully mapped it, and no one who has gone deep inside has ever really come back the same. What I want to do today is not just describe it from the outside. Anyone can read you the dimensions, and anyone can cite the classifications and the Deathwatch protocols and the formal records. What I want to do is take you inside. I want to walk you through every layer of this impossible structure, from the outermost hull all the way into whatever dark heart it might have. I want to explain what it sounds like in there, what the air tastes like, what lives in the dark, and what it does all day, every day, while the Hulk drifts through the void on its endless ancient circuit. I want to show you what it means that people, human people, are alive in there right now. And I want to walk through what happens when the Deathwatch finally answers the call to go in after them. Let's begin where all things like this begin, with the question of what exactly it even is. Part 1. What is a space hulk, and why does this one terrify everyone? To understand Mortis Thuler, you first need to understand what a space hulk actually is, and why even the most basic version of one is considered to be among the most dangerous things a void sailor can encounter. The warp is not like space. Space is empty in a way that the human mind can almost grasp. A vast, cold, largely featureless void through which objects travel at tremendous speeds and enormous distances separate everything from everything else. The warp is not empty. It is full. It is the dimension of pure psychic energy that underlies all of real space. A churning, a howling sea of emotion and dream and nightmare made into a kind of matter. Every feeling ever felt by any thinking creature, every fear, every hope, every burning hatred and desperate love, all of it accumulates in the warp, given form by the weight of all those minds pressing against the barrier between dimensions. Ships travel through the warp because it allows them to cover distances in real space that would otherwise take centuries. You enter the warp, you travel through it for a subjective period of hours or days or weeks, and you emerge somewhere else in real space, having covered a distance that light itself would have needed thousands of years to cross. It is the only reason humanity's Imperium can exist at the scale it does. Tens of thousands of worlds, all connected by that screaming, roiling sea of nightmare fuel, all dependent on vessels capable of surviving inside it long enough to get from one port to another. But ships do not always make it through. The warp is not predictable. Its currents are not fixed. The same route that took a week of subjective travel last month might take a decade this month. And some ships, caught by the wrong current, or betrayed by failing engines, or simply the victim of catastrophic bad luck, do not emerge where or when they intended. Some do not emerge at all. They drift in the warp indefinitely, is slowly coming apart or slowly being changed by the energy that saturates them, and sometimes drawn together by currents and eddies in the immaterial sea. Multiple wrecked ships collide with each other and with drifting matter, asteroids, ancient debris, chunks of dead worlds, things that have no name in the catalogues of human science, and compress into a single mass. The warp fuses them together in ways that ignore the normal rules of how solid objects work. Corridors from one ship align with corridors from another ship that was built 1,000 years later on a different continent, of a different world, in a different galaxy. Gravity wells form inside enclosed spaces. Atmospheres accumulate in pockets that should be exposed to vacuum. Warp energy soaks into the very hull plates like water into old wood. And then, eventually, this mass emerges from the warp. It erupts into real space without warning, sometimes in the middle of shipping lanes, and sometimes in the orbital path of inhabited worlds. It is enormous. It is inert. It is absolutely infested with things that have had centuries in the warp to grow and change and adapt, and it represents both the most terrifying hazard imaginable and, for those desperate or ambitious or faithful enough, an incomprehensible treasure trove of lost technology, lost records, lost wonders from ages past. That is a space hulk. That is what Mortis Thuler is, taken at its most basic. Well, there is one more thing worth understanding about space hulks in general before we get to the specifics of this one, and it is the thing that explains why the Imperium does not simply blow them up whenever they appear. You might reasonably ask, if a space hulk is this dangerous, why not just destroy it? The Imperium has capital ships. It has nova cannons, weapons capable of reducing entire cities to craters from orbit. Thus, why not simply obliterate every space hulk on sight and be done with the threat? The answer, frustrating as it is, comes down to two things. First, space hulks are extraordinarily resistant to destruction. Their nature, hundreds or thousands of ships fused into a single mass, and the joints between them filled with warp-solidified material that is not quite metal and not quite rock, and absorbs kinetic and explosive energy in ways that neither metal nor rock does, makes them almost impossibly durable. Even nova cannon fire does not cause significant damage to a large space hulk. The mass simply absorbs it. You would need sustained, concentrated fire from an entire fleet over an extended period to meaningfully reduce a large hulk. And that assumes the hulk cooperates by staying in one place, which it generally does not. If it dips back into the warp during the bombardment, you have achieved nothing. Second, and this is where the Imperium's perpetual desperation intersects with the problem, space hulks contain things of immense value. The Dark Age of technology, that period before the Age of Strife, when human science reached heights it has never approached since. As when the standard template constructs were being developed and humanity was building wonders that the current Imperium can barely maintain, let alone replicate, produced ships of extraordinary capability. Many of those ships were lost, caught in the warp storms of the Age of Strife, becoming the building blocks of the space hulks that now drift through the galaxy. Every boarding mission to a space hulk carries with it the possibility of recovering an STC fragment as a functional example of ancient technology, a data core containing knowledge that could reshape the Imperium's technological capabilities. The Adeptus Mechanicus will fight to board space hulks that would terrify even veteran space marines, because what they might recover is worth dying for on the scale of long-term human civilization. Mortis Thuler specifically has produced recoverable technology on multiple boarding missions, while the Inquisition and the Death Watch have classified most of these findings under security designations that prevent the details from being shared outside specific circles. But the fact of recoveries is itself on record. Something in the accumulated mass of Mortis Thuler, some specific ship or collection of ships, whose identity is never directly stated in accessible records, contains things that the most powerful and secretive organizations in the Imperium consider worth risking kill teams to retrieve. This is not a small thing to consider when you are trying to understand why the Standing Order exists and why it is maintained with such consistency despite the losses it produces. Now here is what makes Mortis Thuler different from every other space hulk ever recorded. First, its age. When the earliest confirmed record of it dates to Millennium 30, the era of the Great Crusade, the time when the Emperor of Mankind was leading his armies of superhuman space marines across the galaxy to reunite scattered human worlds under Imperial rule. The expeditionary fleets of that era encountered Mortis Thuler drifting through the Jericho sector, but the records do not stop there. When the xenoarchaeologists of the 427th Expeditionary Fleet reached the otherwise unremarkable world of Shinnō, a planet in the rimward reaches of what would become the Jericho Reach, whose native civilization was destroyed during the Great Crusade, they found something extraordinary. Pictograms carved into stone by that extinct alien species, depicting a dark shadow in the sky, earthquakes, meteor showers, and the descent of terrible, as unnatural beasts that slaughtered the natives without apparent purpose or reason. These pictograms were dated to approximately 12,000 Terran years before the Great Crusade. 12,000 years before the Great Crusade. Which means Mortis Thuler was already out there, already large enough to blot out the sun of inhabited worlds, already disgorging its passengers onto planets it drifted past, at a time when human civilization was in its earliest technological adolescence. It was not young then. The accumulation of so much mass does not happen in a single human lifetime, nor a single imperial age. The core of what would eventually become Mortis Thuler is almost certainly ancient beyond any reckoning the Imperium's scholars have yet attempted. Second, its size. This is where things become difficult to describe without reaching for analogies that still fall short of the reality. Most space hulks are large in the sense that a Navy warship is large, overwhelming, intimidating, impossible to fully comprehend while standing next to it. Some are larger still, collections of dozens of vessels compressed together into an irregular mass that might be several kilometers across. Mortis Thuler is not that. Mortis Thuler easily outmasses even Bastion-class space stations, those vast permanent orbital installations that anchor entire sectors of the Imperium's infrastructure. Its unprecedented size is described as comparable to a continent or a small moon. When it passes near a star system, it does not pass unnoticed. It dims local suns. Its gravity affects the orbital paths of nearby objects. Navigators across the entire Jericho Reach feel its presence in the warp before it emerges into real space, the way you might feel the vibration of approaching thunder in your sternum before you hear the sound. Third, it keeps growing. Most space hulks, exposed to real space and the forces of physics that apply there, slowly shed mass over time. They fragment, or lose pieces to micro-impact and radiation stress, eventually either fall apart entirely or simply decrease until they are just another small wreck drifting in the void. Mortis Thuler does not do this. Every time it has been recorded, and the records are extensive, compiled over millennia by the Inquisition, the Death Watch, navigators, void sailors, and the terrified populations of worlds that have watched it pass. It is larger than before. It captures new vessels. It absorbs new debris. It pulls things into itself with a gravitational hunger that seems in some way deliberate, though the Mechanicus adepts who study it have never been able to agree on whether it has any form of purpose, or whether it is simply physics at an unusual scale. The most credible theory for why Mortis Thuler behaves differently from other space hulks involves the Jericho Moor warp gate. This ancient structure, whose origins predate the Imperium by an enormous margin, again creates a permanent and unusually stable connection between the Jericho Reach and the broader galaxy. The energies it generates appear to anchor Mortis Thuler to this region of space in a way that prevents it from ever truly drifting beyond the Reach's boundaries. Unlike other space hulks that appear once and are never seen again in the same region, Mortis Thuler always comes back. It disappears into the warp for decades or sometimes centuries, but it always returns. Whilst it has been returning to the Jericho Reach for at least 12,000 years, and probably longer. Whatever the gate does for it, whether it provides energy or acts as a kind of anchor or produces some warp current that guides the Hulk's re-emergence, it seems to sustain the Hulk across timescales that should be impossible. That is the thing you carry with you as context for everything that follows. Mortis Thuler has been doing this longer than most human cultures have existed. It will almost certainly still be doing it long after the civilizations alive today have been buried, forgotten, and replaced. Part 2. The Architecture of Ruin. What it is actually like inside. Let me put you inside. You have boarded the Hulk. Maybe you are Deathwatch, sealed inside Terminator armor that turns your body into a walking bunker. The ancient sacred plate fitting over your gene-enhanced flesh like a second skeleton. Maybe you are an explorator of the Adeptus Mechanicus. Your organic parts supplemented by mechadendrites that taste the electromagnetic spectrum for you, your mind augmented with the capacity to process information that would overwhelm an ordinary human consciousness. Maybe, and this is the darkest possibility, you are simply a person, a navigator, or a crew member, or an inquisitorial retinue member, armored in standard void suit and armed with whatever you could carry. They dropped into the outer corridors of Mortis Thuler with a purpose and a prayer and very little else. Whatever you are, this is what you encounter. The first thing is the surface of the hull itself, and even this is not simple. Because Mortis Thuler is composed of hundreds or possibly thousands of individual vessels, its outer surface is not a uniform thing. It is a landscape, a geological formation, as strange and varied as a mountain range. Except every feature of it was once a piece of engineering. A ship's armor plate, a turret housing, a sensor array, a docking clamp, a fuel tank, a cargo container, a piece of habitat module from some long-dead generation ship, all of it pressed and fused and overlapping. Hull plates from ships built 1,000 years apart, in entirely different parts of the galaxy, touching each other. The welds that join them are not clean. The warp fuses things in ways that ignore human metallurgy. You will see where two sections have melted into each other and then cooled into something that is neither of the original materials. Something that looks like metal, but has a texture like bark, or like bone, or like dried resin. You will see places where the fusing went wrong and tore edges away, leaving jagged metal cliffs dozens of meters high. You will see places where something has grown across the seam, not a biological growth or not exactly, but a kind of crystalline structure that precipitates out of the warp-soaked material under certain conditions, growing slowly, branching, filling gaps. The light outside is the cold light of deep space, which is to say, almost nothing at all, punctuated by whatever you have brought with you. Inside, it is something different. Some sections of Mortis Thuler still have functioning power systems, emergency lighting running on reactor cores that have been going for centuries, drawing on fuel sources that should have been exhausted long ago, sustained by something. Warp energy bleeds into the machinery in ways the Omnissiah's servants categorize as corruption, but which functionally means that some things just keep working without any reason to do so. These sections are lit in the deep amber of ancient lumens, their phosphor tubes long degraded, casting a sickly yellow-orange that turns everything the color of old photographs. Shadows in this light are not clean. They pool in corners. They shift when you look away, which might be the result of flickering power, or might not be. Other sections have no power at all, and here you rely entirely on what you carry. The torches and helmet lights of your armor throw hard pools of white against walls that were not designed for this. You notice, in that stark illumination, that the corridor you are moving through appears to be 3 different corridors simultaneously. On your left, the wall is clearly part of a naval transport. The blast-proof paneling and stenciled emergency markers of a military vessel still legible despite centuries of grime. On your right, it is something much older, the curved ceramite of something from the dark age of technology, its surface etched with symbols that no living tech priest can fully interpret. And the floor beneath your feet is the exterior hull of a 3rd vessel, hull plates facing inward. The ablative coating designed to shed atmospheric heat now grinding under your boots, the seams between plates irregular, one edge higher than another, constantly threatening to catch a foot or throw your balance. In these dark sections, you will also notice the biological evidence of what lives in the hulk in ways that are harder to see in better lit areas. The walls are not clean. They are coated, in varying degrees depending on the section, as with a biological residue that the Death Watch's apothecaries classify as organic compounds of indeterminate origin, a catch-all designation for the accumulated exudate of centuries of organisms living and dying in close quarters with these surfaces. In some areas, it has the texture of a very old, very dark varnish. In others, it is thick and fibrous, like something has been growing slowly across the surfaces and then drying repeatedly, building up over generations into a layer that is genuinely several centimeters thick. In the areas adjacent to Genestealer territory, it has a quality that even through the filters of a sealed suit you are aware of, a faintly luminescent quality in certain conditions, almost bioluminescent but not quite, that the Death Watch's xenobiologists have been studying for decades without reaching consensus on its source. More, the things you find in the corridors of the dead sections, the sections that have been unoccupied or minimally occupied for extended periods, are the most interesting from a historical standpoint and the most unsettling from a personal one. You will find the remains of equipment, not just broken ships and failed machinery, but the personal equipment of individuals. Void suits in various states of decomposition, tools, weapons, drained of ammunition and left where they fell or propped against walls where their owners set them down while doing something else and then did not come back for them. Personal effects. In sealed containers where the environment has preserved them, or in states of decay where it hasn't, or fused into the surfaces of the hull by the kind of warp-induced integration that makes Mortis Thuler unique. There are places in the hull where a human hand is embedded in a wall, not crushed or smashed. Integrated, incorporated, part of the wall's structure now, the bones visible through the ceramic layer that has grown over it over the centuries, the ring still on one finger, the knuckles still in the position of someone reaching for a door handle that they never quite touched. The gravity is not consistent. This is one of the most disorienting things about moving through the interior. In some sections, it pulls down with more than one standard gravity, and you move carefully, and every step a deliberate placement. In others, it drops away to a fraction of standard, and you must consciously prevent yourself from floating, gripping handholds, and moving along surfaces with the careful deliberation of a void suit wearer. In some sections, the ones that the veterans of Epsilon 990 warn about most sharply, the gravity shifts mid-corridor, not gradually, but with a sharp transition point. As a doorway or a junction where one side is pulling you in one direction and the other side is pulling you in an entirely different one. Veteran boarding parties mark these transitions. The Death Watch have catalogued dozens of them, but the catalogue is never complete because the interior of Mortis Thuler is not static. Things shift. Sections that were accessible on one mission are sealed by the next, not because someone closed a door, but because the hulk has moved in some internal way. As the slow settling and compression of centuries of accumulated mass producing changes that happen too slowly to observe but are clearly visible when comparing mission maps months apart. The air. Oh, the air is something special. In sections with functioning atmospheric processes, and there are more of these than you would expect, another product of warp-sustained machinery running far past any rational lifespan, the air is breathable technically. Your instruments will tell you the oxygen content is within survivable parameters. What they will not tell you, because there is no instrument calibrated to detect it, is what the air feels like in your lungs. Void sailors who have served aboard ships with warp contamination talk about a quality to contaminated air that is hard to describe. It is not a smell exactly, though there is usually a smell. Old metal and ozone and something organic and decomposing and something else. It's something that lacks a name because nothing in normal experience is its closest comparison. It is more a sensation. The feeling that the air you are breathing has been breathed before, not just recycled, but breathed by things that left something of themselves in it. That the act of breathing it makes you part of something you cannot see. Some descriptions from Deathwatch veterans use the word wrong. The air tastes wrong. It tastes like the warp, which is to say it tastes like too much. Key like signal drowning signal, like a frequency too high for ears to process, but low enough to feel in the jaw. In sections without atmospheric processes, the air is different again. It should not be there at all. The sections should be vacuum, cold, and dead. Some of them are. You move through them in sealed suit, relying entirely on your own internal supply, and you are careful because the vacuum sections do not respect their own boundaries. You will sometimes move through an open hatchway from a vacuum section into an atmosphere section and feel the pressure differential on the outside of your suit, the faint mist of air trying to escape through the gap before sealing. Other times, for no detectable reason, you will move through a hatchway that should lead from an atmospheric section into vacuum and find more atmosphere on the other side. Slightly different composition, slightly different temperature. Earth the product of different machinery or different populations of living things, but breathable. The Hulk breathes after a fashion. Its internal atmosphere is not managed. It simply is, distributed by no system that anyone can fully understand, pooling in sections like water pooling in pockets of stone. And the temperature, cold. Almost everywhere in Mortis Thuler, the ambient temperature is well below what would be comfortable for an unaugmented human. Not always lethally cold, but bone cold. The kind of cold that seeps through layers and settles into joints and makes every movement feel slightly more effortful than it should. There are warm sections, usually near functioning reactors or near concentrations of living things that generate body heat in sufficient quantity to noticeably affect the environment. But the default condition of Mortis Thuler is cold. Ancient cold. At the cold of a machine that has been switched off for a very long time and has slowly equilibrated with the space around it. The sounds. This is the part that boarding parties describe in the most careful terms. The part that even hardened Space Marine veterans mention in their mission reports, in ways that suggest it affects them. Mortis Thuler is not silent. A dead ship in the void is silent. Mortis Thuler is not silent. It sounds like a building in the middle of a storm. Well, except there is no storm. The sounds are internal, produced by the mass of the Hulk itself settling and shifting and contracting in the cold, by materials that were joined by the warp, now experiencing different rates of thermal expansion, by sections of hull, under stresses, they were never designed to bear that groan and flex, and occasionally crack. The sounds travel in ways that sound cannot travel in a normal structure. A groan from 3 kilometers away arrives at your ears at the same volume as a creak from 3 meters away. Sound bounces between sections with wildly different acoustic properties, arriving distorted and layered and wrong. And underneath all of this, almost at the edge of hearing, is something else. Something veterans describe as a hum, a resonance, as if the entire structure were vibrating at a frequency just below the threshold of sensation. As a bass note that you feel in your teeth and sternum and the backs of your eyes before you hear it with your ears. The psychers among the Deathwatch kill teams, their librarians in their ancient Terminator plate, describe it differently. They say the sound is coming from the warp, that the Hulk vibrates with the energy soaked into it, that every meter of hull and every fused junction and every crystal growth is resonating with the Imperium like a struck bell that has been ringing for 12,000 years. They describe it in the careful, clinical language of their reports, as like hearing everyone who has ever died inside the Hulk still speaking, all at once, at the same volume, saying different things. The interior spaces themselves are not uniform, and you will pass through corridors so tight that even in standard void armor, you move sideways, the walls pressing close, the ceiling almost brushing the top of your helmet. You will then pass through chambers so vast that your lights cannot find the far walls, that your helmet rangefinder measures at hundreds of meters in every dimension, spaces that were clearly the cargo holds of enormous freighters or the hangar bays of capital ships, and now fused into a single open cave where you feel exposed in a way that narrow corridors never made you feel. Somewhere between these extremes are the spaces that feel most like what they were, actual ship interiors, the ghosts of bridge sections with their chairs still bolted to the floor at their tactical stations, the empty husks of crew quarters where the shapes of sleeping berths are still visible, even if everything organic that was ever in them has long since decomposed or been consumed. Hey, the ruins of mess halls and cargo handling bays and engineering decks. Some of these preserved interiors are deeply unsettling because they look almost like somewhere you could live, almost like somewhere people did live once. And then you realize that the door to the bridge is sealed and fused shut and has not been opened in 800 years. And you realize that you do not actually know what sealed it. And you realize you have been standing in that bridge for 3 minutes without looking at the secondary entry points to check whether they are also sealed. And then you look at the secondary entry points and one of them is open. Part 3. A history carved in metal. From Millennium 18 to the present. Before we discuss who lives in this place and how they manage it, take a moment to understand the shape of Mortis Thuler's history. Because this structure is not just a building with a dark past. It is an accumulation. Everything that has ever happened to it is still in it, layered like sediment, readable to those with the knowledge to look. The earliest evidence of its existence, as mentioned, are those pictograms on Shinnō. An extinct Xenos species, one of the many non-human civilizations that the Great Crusade destroyed without preservation or study, another of the galaxy's irreplaceable losses, carved images of something that darkened their sky into the walls of their structures. The pictograms show something vast and dark, vaguely oblong, with protruding structures that might be ship superstructures or might be something the carvers did not have a name for. Around it, drawn in the chaotic scratch style of something seen and then immediately escaped from, are smaller forms descending from the dark mass to the planet's surface. The natives of Shinnō apparently experienced what Mortis Thuler's passengers always eventually produce. A visitation, a boarding in reverse, at the living things carried inside the Hulk descending on their world. What those beings were 12,000 years ago, before the Great Crusade changed the composition of the Hulk again, no one knows. The Inquisition has speculated. The Death Watch librarians have speculated. Their speculations are filed under the Omega Vault Decree classification, which means that whatever they have concluded is considered too dangerous or too disruptive to share outside the highest circles of the Ordo Xenos. What the pictograms show is just claws and teeth and shapes that hurt the eye. What the pictograms show is that something came down and nothing was the same after. Between that evidence and the Great Crusade's first confirmed encounter, there are 12,000 years of history that Mortis Thuler simply contains, invisibly, embedded in its structure. During the Great Crusade, the expeditionary fleets of the emerging Imperium did what Death Watch kill teams do now. They boarded, they mapped, but they catalogued and they filed reports. Some of those reports survive in the archives at Watch Fortress Eriok. They describe a Hulk recognizably similar to the one that haunts the Reach today, though smaller. A detail that tells you something disturbing about how much it has grown since. Then came the Age of Shadow. The Jericho Reach's Age of Shadow is what historians call the period when the sector effectively collapsed. Warp storms increased in frequency and intensity. Communication and travel became impossible at scale. Worlds that had been part of the Imperium for generations found themselves isolated, cut off from reinforcement, from the Astronomican's light, from each other. Civilizations that had been imperial worlds for centuries devolved into pre-technological states within a few generations, the knowledge of how to maintain the technology they had inherited fading faster than it could be transmitted. But the records of Mortis Thuler from this period are sparse because almost no one was keeping records of anything. The hulk continued to appear, continued to drift, continued to grow, and to deposit its passengers on whatever world it passed nearest. But the people it visited could not report that fact to anyone, because there was no one to report it to. One exception stands out. But the tech heretics of Samek, a dark forge world whose population of Adeptus Mechanicus adepts, eventually fell to what the Inquisition later classified as a particularly insidious form of tech heresy, apparently conducted extensive investigations of Mortis Thuler during the Age of Shadow. They left no history of what they found. This is not because no records were kept. It is because whatever they documented, whatever conclusions they reached about the Hulk, was considered so dangerous that when the Inquisition eventually moved against Samek, the complete erasure of those records was one of their primary objectives. The Inquisitors did not merely burn the findings, they burned the people who had read the findings. Whatever the adepts of Samek learned about Mortis Thuler during those long, dark centuries, the Imperium decided with unusual unanimity that it must never be known. The re-emergence of the Jericho Reach into the broader Imperium, enabled by the rediscovery and activation of the Jericho Moor Warp Gate in the late 41st millennium, is also when Mortis Thuler became visible again to Imperial attention. The Achilles Crusade poured through the gate, tens of thousands of Imperial Guard soldiers and Space Marine warriors and fleet assets, driving into the Reach to reclaim it. And the very first sightings of Mortis Thuler returned to the logs. Not with surprise, the records existed, and going back to the Great Crusade, but with a kind of renewed dread, because the sightings described something larger than any previous record, something that had been growing and changing and absorbing new material during all those long centuries when no one was watching. The Death Watch established Standing Order Epsilon 990 in response to this re-emergence. We will discuss this in detail later. What matters for the history is that since then, the Death Watch has been tracking Mortis Thuler with the same intensity that an ancient mariner tracks a storm, every sighting logged, every boarding mission carefully recorded, and yet the full picture remains frustratingly incomplete. The Hulk disappears for decades at a time. No sighting of it has ever been logged anywhere outside the Jericho Reach, which suggests it is somehow anchored there despite disappearing into the warp, perhaps drawn back each time by the Jericho Moorgate, as perhaps following some vast, looping warp current that always returns it to the same region. But when it reappears, it is always different, always slightly changed. Always, the Death Watch veterans note, with controlled unease, a little more. Part 4. The Silent Rulers. What Genestealers Do. All day in the dark. When you think about what lives in Mortis Thuler, what first comes to mind for most people who know anything about 40,000 lore is Genestealers, the blue indigo chitin, at the 4 razor-limbed form, the extraordinary speed, the claws that cut through Terminator armor like wet paper on a bad day, the thing that lurks in the dark corridors of space hulks, that has been lurking in space hulks since long before the Tyranids were understood for what they are. Genestealers are the dominant life form aboard Mortis Thuler. They are not just present, they have been present, some lineage of them, for an indeterminate but almost certainly enormous span of time. Long enough to establish something that can only be described, if you observe it without prejudice, as a civilization. Not in the way that word applies to the Imperium or the Eldari or any other species that builds cities and writes records and develops philosophy, but in the functional sense. In the sense that there are structures, relationships, territories, hierarchies, and something like culture governing the behavior of the brood that calls the interior of Mortis Thuler its permanent home. To understand how this works, you need to understand what Genestealers actually are.
Okay, I have to stop here for a second because this is the part of researching this video where I genuinely had to step away from my screen for a minute because the Genestealer thing, the idea that they have been there running the same corridors for potentially 12,000 years, completely cut off from the hive mind, just waiting. That is the detail that got me. Like, most threats in 40k are overwhelming because they're big and loud and they will kill you right now. Mortis tool is scary in a completely different register. It is patient in a way that nothing should be patient, and I think that is what sets it apart from almost everything else in the lore. The warp stuff, the hullcasts, the sheer size of it, all of that is great lore, but the image I keep going back to is the Broodlord, sitting in whatever the deepest section of that thing is, in the dark, and it has been sitting there longer than the Imperium has existed in its current form. It's not waiting for rescue, and it's not suffering, it's just ready, and one day something is going to come close enough that the waiting ends. And that is the kind of lore that keeps me making these videos about this universe. But anyways, let's go back to the video.
And how they are different from almost every other tyrannid organism. Most tyrannids are nothing without the hive mind. Strip them away from synapse coverage, the psionic signal broadcast by larger, more intelligence-gifted tyrannid organisms, and they become confused, directionless, dangerous but chaotic, unable to coordinate. They are components of a larger system, and isolated from that system, they function poorly. Genestealers are different. They have their own collective intelligence, the brood mind, that allows them to function as an autonomous unit independent of any hive fleet. They can operate light years away from the nearest synapse creature and still exhibit the extraordinary coordination that makes them so dangerous. They share perception. An alarm detected by one is known to all within the network. A threat identified by 3 becomes a tactical problem coordinated by hundreds. The brood mind is not as sophisticated or as powerful as the full hive mind of an assembled fleet, but it is enough. It is more than enough for the closed environment of a space hulk. On Mortis Thuler, the Genestealer brood has evolved into something extraordinarily well adapted to its environment, as the isolating pressures of centuries without new genetic input. A hive fleet close enough to provide the instinctive drive to seek new worlds and new hosts is not present in this part of the galaxy. Have produced a population that is stable in a way that newly arrived broods are not. They have divided Mortis Thuler's interior into territories that they maintain through constant patrol, that they adjust when the hulk's internal geography shifts, that they defend with coordinated ferocity against anything that intrudes. The territory boundaries are not marked in any way that a human could read. They are maintained psionic structures, boundaries that every member of the brood knows precisely, that shift and are renegotiated through behaviors that look to an outside observer like violence, but are functioning more like communication. The interior ecology of the Hulk sustains them, not easily, as not abundantly. The Genestealer physiology is capable of extraordinary metabolic parsimony when conditions demand it, but sufficiently. The spaces between the hulls are not entirely dead. Fungal and bacterial organisms, introduced centuries ago, or grown from organic material trapped in the fused sections during warp transit, have spread through the lower levels in the dark and moisture and warmth produced by residual machinery. They are not nutritious in the way that prey organisms would be, but Genestealer metabolism can process an enormous range of organic inputs when nothing better is available. In sections where the atmosphere is thick and the humidity high, growth mats spread across the floors and walls, pale and slow, fed by whatever seeps in. The Genestealers consume these when other food is scarce. They consume each other's shed carapace material. They consume the hullcasts when opportunity presents. They maintain a kind of grinding metabolic minimum that keeps them ready without keeping them fat. The biology of the Mortis Thuler Genestealers has, over the centuries, developed some variations from the standard pure strain that the Death Watch's apothecaries find noteworthy. The isolation, the absence of any hive fleet close enough to maintain direct genetic oversight, has allowed the brood's genome to drift in directions determined entirely by the selection pressures inside the hulk, rather than by the hive mind's engineering priorities. The claws are adapted for surfaces that include ceramite and composites, and fused hull material in addition to flesh. The sensory organs have developed particular sensitivity to the electromagnetic signatures of power armor systems. Some specimens recovered from the Hulk's corridors, the remains of Genestealers killed by successful Deathwatch engagements, have shown carapace modifications in the joint articulation that make them more capable of moving through the particular tight geometry corridors common to the older sections of the Hulk. Evolution in a controlled environment over a very long time, while with very specific selection pressures. The creatures that come off a Mortis Thuler mission report are not quite the same as the creatures that appear in the standard Tyrannid threat assessments. The broodmind's tactical capability, expressed through the collective behavior of the brood, has produced what experienced kill team leaders describe as a doctrine. Not in the formal military sense. There are no commanders issuing orders, no map tables where plans are drawn, no words exchanged. But the pattern of how the Mortis Thuler Genestealers respond to intruders has a consistency across multiple missions, a consistency that goes beyond instinct and suggests something more like learned and shared tactical knowledge. They do not rush. They track. A newly detected boarding party will be followed, at distance and in silence, for an extended period that varies based on factors the Deathwatch has not been able to fully identify. During this following period, as the broodmind is calculating, it is noting the party's movement patterns, their formation spacing, their response times to peripheral threats, the distribution of their weapon systems, the sections they seem to be heading toward, and the sections they seem to be avoiding. And then it picks a moment, a transition point, a junction, a section where the acoustic environment is most disorienting or the lighting is least reliable, and it acts. And when it acts, it does so simultaneously from multiple vectors. The strike designed around exactly the vulnerabilities it has spent that observation period cataloging. The primary food source, the one that matters most to the brood's long-term stability, is the periodic influx of new arrivals. Every time Mortis Thuler appears in real space, there is a period during which other vessels approach it, drawn by curiosity, by the value of whatever technology it carries, by Deathwatch protocol, or by sheer bad navigational luck. Some of those vessels come too close. Some get caught by the Hulk's gravitational influence. Some are absorbed. And the organisms aboard them, human crew, servitors, ratings, Navy personnel, the occasional inquisitorial retinue, become food. Not all at once, not immediately. Sometimes the Genestealers wait, following a new intake through the corridors, learning its habits and its patrol patterns, letting it establish itself before choosing a moment. Sometimes the brood surges almost immediately, a flood of blue chitin down every corridor simultaneously, the broodmind coordinating what would look, from the outside, like a perfectly planned military encirclement. The Genestealer reproductive imperative, the drive to implant the genetic seed in host organisms and thus create hybrid offspring, is present in the Mortis Thuler brood, but is expressed differently than in a brood with regular access to a large host population. In the Hulk's isolated conditions, with only occasional intake of new potential hosts, the brood maintains a careful approach to its Genestealer's kiss. The initial contact is sometimes not immediately lethal. Sometimes an individual is taken, implanted, and then left in a preserved state, alive, not immediately harmed, their body beginning the slow genetic integration that the seed starts, kept in a section of the Hulk where they are protected from other threats. But whether the brood is maintaining a breeding population, or whether it is simply a behavioral holdover from the full cycle that the isolation has made incomplete, is a question the Deathwatch has been unable to fully answer. What they have found, on several missions, is compartments in which people who clearly entered the Hulk alive were clearly alive for an extended period afterward, in conditions that were sustainable if not comfortable before the evidence trail ends. What the trail ended in is not always recoverable. But the fact of the trail's existence suggests that the brood's interaction with new human arrivals is more complicated than simple predation. The hunting behavior inside Mortis Thuler is different from what boarding parties describe when they encounter Genestealers in smaller, simpler space hulks. In a small hulk, the brood is often disorganized, operating on instinct. are flowing toward prey with the mindless hunger of things that have not eaten properly in years. In Mortis Thuler, the hunt has been refined over countless generations. The Genestealers of this hulk know its geography in a way that no external map can capture. They know which sections have acoustic properties that carry footsteps from a kilometer away. They know which gravity wells will slow an armored intruder. They know whether functioning power systems create interference that disrupts scanning equipment. They know how to use the labyrinthine nature of the interior to separate a boarding party, to cut off a retreat, to appear from unexpected angles while a kill team is entirely focused on a threat from the expected direction. The Broodlord, the apex organism that leads the Genestealer population of Mortis Thuler, the most powerful and ancient of its kind aboard this particular vessel, occupies a section of the hulk's interior that no successful Deathwatch mission has yet precisely located. Something in the deepest, oldest sections. Something in the part of the hulk that is made of material that predates the Great Crusade, that is made of ships from civilizations that the Imperium does not even have names for. The librarians of the Deathwatch can feel the Broodlord through the psychic pressure it exerts on the surrounding warp. They describe it as a weight, a cold weight, like standing under a glacier, not the burning furnace heat of a chaos entity or the electric static presence of an orc psychic focus, but something older and heavier and more patient. The Broodlord has been in the hulk for a very long time. It has not needed to hurry about anything in a very long time. There is something philosophically interesting about the Genestealer population of Mortis Thuler, something that the Deathwatch's more contemplative librarians have noted in their private journals rather than their official reports. A Genestealer brood, by its nature, is a temporary thing. It is a seed planted in advance of a hive fleet, designed to infiltrate a host population, establish a cult, and then trigger the arrival of the fleet. The brood's purpose, in the full arc of its existence, is to consume itself, to expand until the fleet arrives, and then to be consumed along with everything else. But on Mortis Thuler, isolated from the hive mind, that arc has been interrupted indefinitely. The brood has been a seed waiting to germinate for centuries, possibly millennia, with no soil to plant itself in. It cannot fulfill its biological purpose. The call to spread outward, to infect and multiply in a host population, is there. It must be there. It built into the genome, but the opportunity has not come. And in that gap between instinct and opportunity, something has formed. Not culture in any way the Inquisition would recognize as significant, not philosophy or art or any of the markers by which humanity measures civilization, but a stability, a depth of adaptation, a relationship with the environment that goes beyond the simple hunger and hunt cycle of a newly infested hulk. Mortis Thuler's Genestealers are not waiting for their story to begin. Their story has already been going for thousands of years. It is just a story that the galaxy has not yet been invited to read. When the hive mind draws close enough, if a hive fleet ever reaches the Jericho Reach in force, the psionic signal that reaches the Broodlord in its deep den will change everything. The ancient patience will end. The thousands upon thousands of Genestealers that have been living their long, cold, watchful lives in the dark will turn outward with a hunger that has been building for 12,000 years. Part 5. The Orc Warrens. Green thunder in the rusting dark. The Genestealers are not the only dominant life form in Mortis Thuler. They are the oldest, possibly. They hold the deepest sections, the most defensible territory, the ground closest to whatever the Broodlord considers its seat of power. But there is a substantial portion of Mortis Thuler where the Genestealers do not go, or do not go unless in numbers, and that is the territory carved out by the Orcs. There are few Orc worlds in the Jericho Reach. During the Great Crusade, the expeditionary forces of the early Imperium were unusually thorough in clearing Orc populations from this part of the galaxy, recognizing even then that the greenskin menace, left to its own devices, would always metastasize into something impossible to remove. The result, thousands of years later, is that the orcs aboard Mortis Thuler did not come from any world nearby. They came from somewhere else. Other sectors, other conflicts, the endless wandering tides of orc freebooters that cross the galaxy on crude space hulks and stolen or bodged together spacecraft, following the scent of conflict the way sharks follow blood in water. At some point, a freebooter warband on a hulk of their own crossed paths with Mortis Thuler, and either by accident or by deliberate choice, yes, the orcs ended up aboard, rather than aboard their original vessel. Imperial scholars believe this may have happened multiple times, which would explain the presence of orc genetic variations, associated with several different clans, visible in what little biological evidence the Death Watch has been able to recover. The orcs of Mortis Thuler have been aboard long enough to make it theirs in ways only orcs can, the orc capacity for improvised engineering. Case for making machines work through sheer biological will and the psychokinetic field that all orc populations generate, has produced results in the Hulk's interior that the Adeptus Mechanicus finds alternately fascinating and deeply heretical. Sections of the Hulk that were dead, systems that were no longer functional, machinery that had not operated in centuries. The orcs turned them on. Not by understanding how they worked, or even in many cases by repairing them in any orthodox sense, but by attaching their own mech-boy-crafted components to defunct systems and running power through them and hammering things until they cooperated, by somehow imprinting their collective psychic field onto machines in ways that make those machines function for orc uses even when they should not function at all. The social hierarchy that has developed among Mortis Thuler's orc population is interesting enough that multiple Death Watch scholars have spent considerable time in their mission debriefs describing it, in between the tactical assessments and casualty reports. The population has been isolated long enough that the typical clan divisions which characterize most orc societies have been somewhat eroded. As the Goths and Bad Moons and Death Skulls of different ancestral lineages are still recognizable in physiological and behavioral tendencies, the Goths still congregate into aggressive, heavily armored fighting groups. The Death Skulls still scavenge everything that isn't bolted down, and some things that are. But the sharp territorial lines that would define a planet-side multi-clan community have blurred. Mortis Thuler has been the orcs' shared home for long enough that shared experience has created something that crosses those lines. The informal but powerful social category of the Hulk veteran. A veteran of Mortis Thuler, in orc terms, is an orc that has survived at least one major Genestealer engagement without immediately retreating, which in the Hulk's context means surviving an ambush in a narrow corridor against the blue chitin tide and fighting your way back out. This is not a formal designation. There is no ceremony and no badge, but it is recognized instantly by every other orc who knows what it means. An orc who has survived inside Mortis Thuler in a serious engagement has proven something about themselves that no amount of surface war experience can prove, because the nature of the threat is different. The Genestealers are fast in a way that an orc's instinctive responses are poorly calibrated for. They come from angles that orc spatial intuition does not naturally cover. Fighting them and surviving requires a combination of endurance and specific adaptation that filters the population over time, leaving a group of veterans who are meaningfully better at fighting inside the Hulk than they would be at fighting almost anywhere else. The result is an orc population that has, by the brutal standards of orc population dynamics, genuinely learned something, or learned it in the way orcs learn things, which is through the bodies of those who didn't survive teaching the survivors what not to do, but learned it nonetheless. The fire teams that Mortis Thuler orcs assemble for Genestealer engagements, informal, always, because formal military organization is not an orc concept, but recognizably coherent in their structure, place their biggest and most armored fighters at junction points while their fastest members sweep corridors, which is exactly the tactical formation that centuries of engagement with corridor hunting Genestealers would select for. They know to watch the ceiling. They know the specific junctions where the blue tide comes in force. and the ones where it sends scouts first. This is not intelligence in any formal sense. It is the species memory of an organism that learns through blood. The result is an orc-controlled section of Mortis Thuler that is genuinely, almost disturbingly, alive. Their lights blaze where there should be darkness, fed by reactors that no one with a formal understanding of reactor maintenance would expect to be running. Temperatures are higher in orc territory than anywhere else in the Hulk. The product of all those blazing machines and the body heat of thousands of orcs and the particular kind of creative chaos that orc machinery generates. There is noise, constant, omnipresent noise, the banging and grinding and roaring of machinery being built and rebuilt, or of orcs arguing about what to build next, of Gretchen being kicked around by orcs who are frustrated with their progress, of fights breaking out and being resolved through escalating applications of violence. The orc territorial sections of Mortis Thuler are probably the most unambiguously, offensively alive places aboard, in the same way that a forge running at full capacity is alive. Everything in motion, everything producing, everything consuming, and everything contributing to a collective output that is deafening and unstoppable. What are the orcs doing in there specifically? Building. They are always building. The mech boys. Those orcs who carry within them a biologically expressed genius for mechanical engineering, an intuitive understanding of how to make things that go bang and move fast and kill things, are the most important individuals in the orc population of Mortis Thuler. Their status in the social hierarchy is different here than in a typical ground-based orc warband. On a planet, a mech boy is valued, but ultimately secondary to the war boss, whose physical dominance determines everything. Aboard Mortis Thuler, where there is nowhere to go and nothing to fight except what lives in the other sections of the Hulk, the ability to keep the lights on and the air breathable and the guns loaded is more immediately important than being the biggest. The mech boys command a social leverage that they do not always have in more conventional orc settings. What they build ranges from the mundane to the extraordinary. Basic weapon maintenance is constant. Orcs require their weapons to function, and the weapons are always breaking down, and fixing them is an endless cycle of work that keeps the lower status Gretchen and smaller orcs occupied for most of their waking hours. Beyond this are the larger projects, the boarding craft that the orcs use to raid vessels that approach the Hulk, heavily modified ships that are barely space-worthy by any sane standard, but that orc engineering makes work anyway through a combination of ingenuity and pure spite toward physics. The fortifications built into the territory boundaries, the doors and barricades and weapons emplacements that define where orc territory ends and Genestealer territory begins. And then the truly ambitious things, the engines that the mech boys are always, apparently, working on. The Death Watch has observed, over multiple Epsilon 990 boarding missions, that the orcs of Mortis Thuler appear to be engaged in a long-term project to install something in the Hulk's core sections. The exact nature of this project changes each time it is observed. Different configurations, different approaches, and evidence of previous attempts having been abandoned and new ones begun. But the general direction is always the same. They want to steer the Hulk. They want to fly it. A freebooter's core ambition pushed to its logical extreme. The biggest ship imaginable, pointed wherever the captain decides. Whether they will ever succeed is another question. The warp-fused nature of Mortis Thuler's construction makes it deeply resistant to being directed. It has its own relationship with the Imperium, and its own patterns of emergence and submersion that have been established over 12,000 years. An orc engine bolted onto the exterior is not going to override that anytime soon, no matter how enthusiastically the mech boys apply themselves. But orcs do not lose enthusiasm because a project is taking a very long time. They are constitutionally suited to indefinitely extended projects, as long as the project continues to involve hammering things. The relationship between the orc and Genestealer populations of Mortis Thuler is one of the most fascinating and underdocumented aspects of the Hulk. It is not simple predator-prey. It is not peaceful coexistence. It is something more complicated, a kind of mutual Cold War maintained through an ongoing series of low-level engagements that function as both territorial negotiation and entertainment for both sides. The orcs raid into Genestealer territory regularly. They're usually in groups large enough to fight their way back out, taking casualties and inflicting them in roughly equal measure. The Genestealers respond with periodic concentrated strikes into orc territory, usually at junctions or doorways where their speed is advantaged over orc mass. Neither side has managed to eliminate the other in all the years they have coexisted on the Hulk. Neither side, in their own way, seems to particularly want to. The orcs would be bored without the Genestealers to fight. The Genestealers, though they do not think in ways that map onto concepts like entertainment, are in some broodmind-level behavioral way engaged by prey that can fight back, that offers a genuine challenge. The Death Watch has observed that Genestealer incursions into orc territory always increase in frequency and intensity when the orc population has recently been reduced, by disease, by internal conflict, or by Death Watch action. Or the Genestealers, through the distributed awareness of the broodmind, know the current state of the orc population with apparent accuracy. They do not press this advantage to its conclusion. Perhaps because eliminating the orcs would require them to invest effort that they are not genetically programmed to spend on other Xeno species rather than potential hosts. Or perhaps because the broodlord, old and patient in its deep den, has some larger calculation that requires the orcs to remain. In the Death Watch, in their classified annotations, have noted this observation and flagged it for further study, and then continued boarding the Hulk anyway, because that is what the standing order requires. Part 6. The Hullcasts. What becomes of those who cannot die and cannot leave? Now we come to the human element, or rather, what was the human element once. There are humans alive inside Mortis Thuler. I want you to understand this clearly. Not human-descended Xenos, and not human-shaped chaos entities, not the impression of humanity worn by something that has no right to wear it. Actual humans, carrying the original genetic sequence, the recognizable physiology of Homo sapiens, alive and moving, and in some functional sense, surviving inside one of the most hostile environments in the Jericho Reach. They got there the same way almost everything gets there. They were aboard ships that Mortis Thuler consumed. Some of those ships were drawn in by accident, are caught in the gravitational influence of the emerging Hulk, and unable to escape before the mass pulled them in. Some were drawn in during warp transit, their vessels merging with the Hulk in the same way all the other ships merged, except that when this happens during transit, rather than in real space, there is sometimes a chance of survival. The warp fusing process occasionally incorporates vessels in ways that leave their internal structure intact, their atmospheres preserved, or their emergency systems functioning. The crew, sealed inside, finds themselves in a working ship that is no longer moving, locked into the mass of Mortis Thuler and unable to extract themselves. The immediate future of such a crew depends on the luck of which sections they find themselves adjacent to. A section near active Genestealer territory is generally a death sentence that plays out over hours or days. As a section near the Orc Warrens might provide a temporary buffer. The orcs are willing to trade, after a fashion, if the humans have something they want, though the trade is never truly safe. A section in what the Death Watch mapping calls the Dead Zones, sections with no large population of either Genestealers or orcs, sections of pure ruin and cold and silence, offers a grim kind of safety, the safety of being temporarily forgotten. But the dead zones do not stay safe. Whereas the humans who survive in them are surviving in an environment that, even without active predators, is actively hostile in every physical dimension. Radiation leaks from ancient, decaying reactor shielding. The warp energy soaked into the hull exerts constant psychic pressure on anyone with latent psychic ability. And given the size of the population that has passed through the Hulk over the centuries, there are always a few with at least traces of that potential. But the organic chemistry of the air affects human bodies in ways that accumulate slowly but irresistibly, building up over years of exposure into a kind of corruption that has no clean name and no clean cure. And the nutritional situation is desperate. Humans aboard Mortis Thuler eat what they can find. Fungal growth, vermin, each other in the worst extremities, and whatever they can scavenge from the ruins of the vessels they now call home. The result, over generations, is the hullcast. Thus, the hullcast is what a human becomes when all of the above processes have their way with a family line over several hundred years. The mutation is not immediate. It is gradual, each generation a little further from the parental form. By the third or fourth generation of a Mortis Thuler-born family, the changes are becoming pronounced. By the seventh or eighth, the connection to the original Homo sapiens form is visible but strained. By the time a lineage has been inside the Hulk for a century of subjective time, what it produces is something that no longer thinks in human terms, no longer communicates in any language derived from human speech, no longer behaves in any way that an observer from outside would recognize as human. The physical form of a hullcasts is disturbing in proportion to your familiarity with what it was derived from. The skin goes pale, almost white. As the result of centuries without significant light exposure, it becomes leathery, thick with a quality that is not natural toughening, but something produced by the chemistry of the Hulk's atmosphere. A kind of keratinous conversion that seals internal moisture better than human skin normally does. Eruptions of bone and horn push through the skin at joints and along the spine. The fingers extend, the nails becoming long, thick, talon-like structures better suited to gripping the irregular surfaces of hull plating than to any fine manipulation. The jaw enlarges out of all proportion to the face, driven by the caloric demands of existence in this environment. The hullcasts must be able to crush and process food sources that would defeat normal human dentition. The teeth become numerous and irregular and extraordinarily hard. The eyes, adapted to the near-total darkness of the Hulk's unlit sections, lose the iris pigmentation that controls light intake, becoming pale and reflective, capable of function at light levels that would leave normal humans entirely blind. What the hullcast retains from its human inheritance is harder to describe. Intelligence, not in any formal or academic sense, but the particular kind of environmental intelligence that comes from needing to survive in an extraordinarily complex and hostile space. They know Mortis Thuler. They know it with an intimacy that no boarding mission has ever achieved, because they have been inside it continuously for generations. And every generation that passed down knowledge of where the air was good and where the Genestealers patrolled, and where the orcs would not go, and where the cold was deepest, and where food could be found. Every generation contributed to a cumulative map that exists not in writing, but in behavior. A hullcast in its section of the Hulk does not navigate consciously. It moves with the certainty of something that has lived in the same building since birth, that can cross a room in complete darkness without hesitation, because it has crossed it 10,000 times. They communicate, not in any language a linguist would recognize, not in any way that produces records or narrative, but the clicking and rasping sounds that hullcasts make to each other carry information. Threat locations, our food sources, the approach of something large, the complex of sound and motion and scent marking that constitutes hullcast interaction encodes knowledge about Mortis Thuler that the Death Watch would love to possess and has never been able to extract. Several Death Watch librarians over the centuries have attempted to establish some form of communication with hullcast populations, carefully, at range, using psionic techniques to get past the layers of behavioral conditioning and try to reach whatever remains of the human cognition underneath. The results of these attempts are not officially recorded in the standard mission reports. In the classified annotations, they are described as disturbing in ways that the librarians are unwilling to elaborate on in written form. The daily existence of a hullcast inside Mortis Thuler, reduced to its essential components, is entirely about the management of 3 ongoing crises: finding food without being eaten by what finds food in the same areas, finding atmosphere that is breathable without moving into sections where something larger and more dangerous is already breathing it, and maintaining body temperature in an environment that would prefer to make everything the same temperature as the void outside. They solve the food problem through a combination of opportunistic predation on the fungal growth layers and smaller organisms, and through a collective knowledge of which sections of the hulk produce consistent biomass. There are sections where the intersection of warmth and moisture and whatever trace organics seep in from the hull produce reliable, if thin, harvests. The hullcasts do not cultivate these sections in any formal sense, but they are present in them regularly. And the repeated presence of the same organisms in the same locations produces a kind of de facto relationship with the section's ecology that functions like tending without being conscious tending. Some sections have been hullcast feeding grounds for generations. The biological evidence, the scratching on walls, the presence of the particular hullcast scent mark, as the arrangement of debris that indicates regular presence, suggests continuous use going back further than any single hullcast lineage would extend. The atmosphere problem is solved through a remarkable developed sensory capacity. Hullcasts can detect, apparently through olfaction or some related chemosensory mechanism, variations in atmospheric composition that would be invisible to unaided human senses. They know before entering a section whether the air is suitable. They know when a previously breathable section is beginning to lose atmosphere. They know when a section adjacent to Genestealer territory has recently had Genestealers in it, which keeps them out of those areas in the same way that wild animals avoid predator-marked territory. The temperature problem is managed through the gregariousness that defines their sleeping behavior. They pile together in numbers large enough to generate collective warmth, in the tightest spaces available, insulating each other against the cold that the hull bleeds inward from the void. These sleeping groups are not random. The same individuals appear to group together consistently, which suggests some form of social bonding that has survived the loss of every other marker of social structure that was once present in their ancestry. Whether this constitutes family in any biological sense, or is simply the product of individuals choosing the warmest possible combination of bodies, is a question the Death Watch's xenobiologists cannot answer from the evidence available. The hullcasts move through Mortis Thuler in patterns that, to the careful observer, are neither random nor fully directed. They follow the same logic the Genestealers do. They know the territory, they know the threat gradients, they know the food distributions. Their ranges overlap with Genestealer territory at the fringes. And the nature of that overlap is interesting. The Genestealers do not hunt hullcasts with the same priority they hunt human intruders, not because they are not capable of it, and not because hullcasts are not edible, but because the broodmind appears to register hullcasts differently from pure-form humans as something partially familiar, a resonance from their own relationship with the warp, some faint shared frequency produced by centuries of parallel existence in the same warp-saturated environment. Hullcasts are not safe around Genestealers, but they are safer than they have any rational right to be, given what else Genestealers do to things they share corridors with. The most unsettling thing about the hullcasts, the thing that the Death Watch veterans mention last and mention most carefully, is this: when you find where they sleep, the nesting areas where they curl in groups in corners that are sealed on three sides and difficult to enter, and you look at what they have arranged around themselves in the dark, you find objects that were not produced on Mortis Thuler, pieces of ceramite in human shapes, circuit boards arranged in patterns, images scratched into hull plating, not with the artistic intention of a human artist, but with something that looks like repetition, as the same shapes scratched over and over, crude and insistent. The shapes include things recognizable as weapons, things recognizable as doors, things that might be people. The Death Watch's current working theory is that the hullcasts are maintaining, across generations of mutation and environmental pressure and behavioral regression, some faint trace of what their ancestors knew. Not as knowledge, not as language, not as thought, in any form you could call structured, but as ritual, as reflex. Yet the shapes scratched in the dark are the memory of being human, expressed by something that no longer is. Part 7. The other presences, enslavers, Kroot, Eldar, and things without names. The Genestealers, and the orcs and the hullcasts are the primary permanent inhabitants of Mortis Thuler. But they are not the only ones. The Hulk, in all its vastness, provides environments and opportunities that attract others, temporarily or semi-permanently, for their own purposes. The enslavers are perhaps the most unsettling of the visiting or secondary populations, for reasons that go well beyond their individual threat level. Enslavers are entities native to the warp, not demons, or at least not demons in the sense that chaos entities are demons, but something older, something that predates the chaos gods by an enormous margin, something that was old when the old ones still lived and the war in heaven was still being fought. But they are psychic predators that exist primarily in the Imperium and can phase into real space through the bodies of psychers, transforming their hosts over the course of 50 to 75 hours into living warp gates through which more of their kind can enter the material universe. They look, in real space, like barrel-shaped, transparent creatures, approximately 2 meters in height, festooned with tentacles, their faces a mask of multiple sensory organs. Their movement a floating drift through the air that has no mechanism you can identify. A space hulk saturated with warp energy is an ideal environment for enslavers. They can shift between the warp and real space with particular ease in a location where the barrier between them has been weakened by centuries of immersion. And a space hulk carrying thousands of Genestealers, every one of them linked to a broodmind, as every one of them carrying a faint but detectable psychic signature, is a rich hunting ground. The Lexicanum records note that enslavers sometimes pursue Genestealer populations on space hulks, playing a kind of cat and mouse with the hybrids and the brood. The Genestealers, aware of this, maintain a strong aversion to any enclosed space that their broodmind detects enslaver presence in. Watching a Genestealer brood suddenly and simultaneously redirect away from an area it was heading toward, but with no visible reason, is one of the markers that experienced Death Watch boarding parties use to infer enslaver activity in adjacent sections. The actual enslaver territories in Mortis Thuler, such as they are, constitute the most psychically hostile zones in the Hulk. Any unshielded psyker entering them will begin to experience symptoms within minutes, the first signs of the enslaver bonding process, at the initial contact that leads to the terrifying transformation of a living person into a warp portal. Even shielded librarians in their full psychic armament report intense pressure in these sections, the sensation of something probing at the edges of their mental fortifications with extraordinary patience and precision. A single enslaver can maintain control over up to 10 subjects simultaneously and does so with a mechanical thoroughness that strips those subjects of independent will completely. The enslaved retain their abilities, their knowledge, and their physical capability. They simply have no access to any of it except through the enslaver's direction. They eat when directed. They sleep when directed. They fight and die when directed, without hesitation, without reaction. Their faces blank. But the Kroot are a more comprehensible presence, though no less dangerous in their way. These tall, avian-featured mercenaries from the Tau Empire, or nominally from it at least. The Kroot's actual allegiance has always been primarily to themselves and to the biological imperative written into their DNA. Visit Mortis Thuler for reasons that are specifically Kroot in nature. The Kroot Shapers, the wise leaders who guide kindred evolution by choosing what their people eat, have apparently determined that some of the biological material inside Mortis Thuler is worth the risk of acquisition. Specifically, they are interested in the Genestealer genome. The Kroot ability to absorb and eventually express the genetic traits of things they consume means that accessing Genestealer material, claws, chitin, biological samples of any kind, offers the possibility of incorporating some tyrannid adaptations into the Kroot genetic heritage. Whether the Kroot Shapers have fully thought through the implications of introducing tyrannid genetic material into their kindreds, given what Genestealer DNA actually does to host organisms over generations, is a question that the Ordo Xenos has raised in its threat assessments of the situation. The answer, based on what little observation has been possible, appears to be not fully. Recruit hunting parties enter the Hulk, operate in small groups of extreme efficiency, harvest what they came for, and attempt to exit. They are better at moving quietly through Mortis Thuler than almost any other non-indigenous organism. Their sensory apparatus well suited to the dark and acoustically chaotic environment. Their social structure producing small units capable of extraordinary coordination. But they are still in Genestealer territory, and the brood finds them eventually, and the engagements that result are fast and brutal in ways that the Kroot, for all their adaptation, do not always survive. The Eldar Pirates. Eldar of the void-faring pirate communities who sail the stars outside the structured society of the craft worlds, interact with Mortis Thuler in a different way. Their interest is less biological and more archaeological, or perhaps tactical. The Eldar, as a species, have been observing Mortis Thuler for a very long time. Longer, possibly, than the Imperium has been aware of it. What they know about it, that the Imperium does not, is filed under the heading of things the Aeldari have never chosen to share. And the Aeldari rarely choose to share things when the alternative is letting the younger races blunder around in dangerous situations without the relevant context. Eldar Corsair bands enter the Hulk occasionally, moving through it with the grace and efficiency that their physiological and technological advantages provide. And they emerge with things. Artifacts are sometimes data, possibly. The specific purpose of their visits, like so much Eldar behavior, is not readily interpretable by anyone they haven't chosen to explain themselves to, which is to say, essentially no one. And then there are the things that do not have clean categories. The warp entities, the hull things, the forms that emerge from the most deeply saturated sections of the structure, that have been produced by centuries of warp energy acting on organic and inorganic material without the oversight of any controlling intelligence. These are not demons, exactly, though the distinctions matter mainly to chaos theologians. They are something more local, more specific. Something that Mortis Thuler itself has generated, the way long-contaminated water generates things in it that clean water does not. Things that move through the deepest corridors on no apparent purpose, that react to the presence of organic life with either indifference or a slow, terrible interest, that cannot be fully killed because they do not fully exist, that are neither truly in real space nor truly in the warp, but in the gap between. The Death Watch's librarians call this category of entity resonance manifestation, and their official position is that these entities are produced by the intersection of strong warp currents with the specific material composition of the oldest sections of the Hulk. Their unofficial position, expressed in the classified annotations, is considerably more alarmed. The oldest sections of Mortis Thuler, the sections that predate the Great Crusade by thousands of years, the sections whose composition no Mechanicus adept has been able to fully analyze, are producing something that none of the standard categories quite cover, and the rate of production appears to be increasing. Part 8. The Emperor's Gaze and the Question of Human Survival. Among the many vessels absorbed by Mortis Thuler over the centuries, one stands apart in the imagination of those who know about it: the Emperor's Gaze. The Emperor's Gaze was an imperial diplomatic vessel. As part of the fleet support structure of the Achilles Crusade in the late 41st millennium, its function was communication and negotiation, moving between the Crusade's many operational theaters, carrying envoys and messages, and the complex administrative machinery of a multi-front military campaign. It was struck off the Crusade's fleet registry when it was determined to have been lost in the warp, a tragedy, but not an unusual one in a region where warp travel is as dangerous as it is in the Jericho Reach, except that it was not entirely lost. The Emperor's Gaze was caught by Mortis Thuler, and unlike most vessels caught by the Hulk, it was not destroyed in the absorption. Something about the geometry of the encounter, the angle of impact, the specific way the warp currents interacted with the vessel's still active Geller field during the moment of fusion, preserved the ship's internal structure. But the crew survived the absorption. They found themselves aboard a vessel that was now part of a vast structure, with functioning life support, functioning power, functioning weapons, but no way to disengage from the mass they had been fused into. The last confirmed communication from the Emperor's gaze was received by an astropathic relay shortly after the absorption. The message was brief, a position report of sorts, a description of the situation, as a request for instructions, and it was received, but no extraction mission was mounted. The crusade was stretched thin, Mortis Thuler was unpredictable, and the tactical calculus of sending a rescue fleet to board the largest and most dangerous space hulk in the reach to extract a diplomatic vessel was not one that the Crusade's commanders could easily justify. The navigator's family aboard the Emperor's gaze believes the crew may still be alive. This is not entirely wishful thinking. Or Imperial Void crew, well supplied, with intact life support systems, could theoretically survive inside Mortis Thuler for years or even decades. The question is how they would be spending that time. The Genestealer population would find them eventually, would almost certainly have found them already. The encounter would produce one of three outcomes. The crew is consumed, in which case survival is not relevant. If the crew is killed outright in an engagement with no Genestealer survivors to carry the brood further, which is possible if the crew was sufficiently armed and trained. Or a Genestealer reaches a crew member with its ovipositor, planting the genetic seed that begins the cult cycle. If that third option occurred aboard the Emperor's gaze, then what is now inside that preserved vessel is not the crew the navigator's family mourns. As it is the first generation of a Genestealer cult, hybrid beings that look almost human, think almost in human terms, remember something of their parents' lives, and are building toward the moment when their brood is large enough to act. And they are doing so inside a preserved Imperial diplomatic vessel that still has functioning communication systems. The Death Watch knows this is a possibility. The Death Watch knows several things about the Emperor's gaze that have not been formally communicated to the navigator's family, including the fact that one of the Epsilon 990 boarding missions identified what appeared to be human hybrid biological material in a section of the hulk consistent with the Emperor's gaze's last known position. The formal mission report on this finding is 6 words long. It categorizes the material as threat status Xenos minoris and notes that the area was cleared. The classified annotation attached to this report is 17 pages long and was immediately sealed under the Omega Vault decree. The question of what happens to human consciousness inside Mortis Thuler, in a situation where survival is possible, is one that goes beyond the Emperor's gaze. It is a question about what the Hulk does to minds over time. But the warp exposure alone is sufficient to produce meaningful psychological changes in baseline humans over weeks of continuous contact with warp-saturated material. The sensory environment, the sounds, the atmosphere, the gravity fluctuations, the constant low-level psychic pressure adds layers of stress that accumulate without relief. And then there is the deeper question, the question of what lives in the warp itself, or what drifts through the saturated walls of the Hulk and brushes against the minds of anyone inside. The specific nature of long-term human survival in Mortis Thuler has been the subject of considerable inquisitorial attention, partly because the question of what is happening aboard the Emperor's gaze cannot be separated from the question of what the Hulk does to people who stay. The early stages are documented by mission reports from boarding parties that included medical personnel. The first 48 to 72 hours inside the Hulk produce effects that are broadly consistent across recorded cases. Elevated stress hormones, sleep disruption, if sleep is possible, difficulty concentrating, attributed to the acoustic environment and the visual complexity of the interior, mild sensory disorientation produced by the irregular gravity fields. All of these are manageable. They are the normal human response to an extremely stressful and unfamiliar environment. After 7 days, the changes are different. The psychers among boarding parties who have spent extended time inside the Hulk begin to describe their experience of the broodmind's presence differently, not as an external pressure, but as something that has become a fixed feature of their internal landscape, present even when they are not actively reaching for it. Non-psychers begin to report sounds from sections they are not adjacent to, sounds that no instrument registers, sounds that are nonetheless consistent across individuals in the same location. Dreams, when sleep occurs, are shared, different people in the same section reporting the same imagery without prior communication. And there is a growing feeling, reported with striking consistency, of being watched by something that is not in the room but is nonetheless aware. By the end of 30 days, the individuals who are not psychers have typically developed a low level of psychic sensitivity that they did not have before. Not significant, not operationally relevant, not the kind of sensitivity that would register on the Black Ship's assessment tools, but enough to feel the brood mind, enough to know, without looking, when something large is moving in the section adjacent to yours. The warp-saturated environment appears to function as an accelerant for latent psychic potential, at pushing individuals incrementally across the threshold of sensitivity that separates the psychic null from the subtly aware. What this means for a crew that has been inside for years, or for the hybrid population that the Emperor's gaze may now contain, is a level of environmental awareness and mutual connectedness that would be extraordinary in any other context. It also means a level of vulnerability to the entities that feed on psychic emanation that the Death Watch does not like to think about at length. Psychers who have been inside Mortis Thuler for any length of time come out changed. Not always in ways that the Inquisition feels compelled to investigate, not always in ways that require the word corruption, but changed. More sensitive to certain kinds of signals, more aware of spaces where something has happened, or where something is still happening in some sense that evades normal description, more likely to describe silence as populated. The Death Watch librarians who have served on multiple Epsilon 990 missions describe a cumulative effect. Each boarding takes you slightly further from the mental state you arrived in. The effect is not dramatic. It is gradual. It accumulates. And it never entirely reverses. Part 9. Standing Order, Epsilon 990. What it means to board the Death Watch. Standing Order, Epsilon 990 is, in the formal language of its written text, brief. Any kill team that logs a new sighting of Mortis Thuler emerging into real space must perform a full sensor sweep of its current form and configuration, and, having done so, execute an immediate boarding mission. This order can only be overridden by the direct command of a watch commander or an inquisitor. It has been overridden, in all the history of the Death Watch's engagement with Mortis Thuler in a handful of instances. Everyone else who has encountered the Hulk's emergence has boarded it. Let us be clear about what that means in practice. The Death Watch does not go into Mortis Thuler the way a boarding party enters a disabled enemy vessel. There is no formal declaration of purpose, no organized entry through a secured breach point. Is no coordinated element moving through a structure that is slowly being pacified behind them. Epsilon 990 boarding missions enter Mortis Thuler the way you enter a flood, with the full understanding that the environment you are entering is actively hostile in every dimension, and that your job is not to dominate it, but to survive it long enough to accomplish specific objectives. The kill team itself is typically composed of Space Marines drawn from multiple chapters, or as all Death Watch kill teams are, each bringing specialist capabilities that the mission profile requires. For Mortis Thuler deployments, standard composition tends to heavily weight toward durability and close-quarters combat effectiveness. The corridors of the Hulk are too narrow and too acoustically chaotic for the kind of ranged engagement strategies that work in open environments. This is one of the reasons that Terminator armor, when available, is preferred for these missions. The extra protection that tactical Dreadnought armor provides is not merely a defensive comfort. It is a practical necessity in an environment where a Genestealer can close the distance from detection to contact in under 2 seconds, in a space too tight to maintain safe engagement distances. The armor's signum systems also help maintain formation awareness in conditions where visuals are frequently limited and audio is useless as a directional indicator. as entry to the hulk is typically via boarding torpedo or Thunderhawk insertion, with the entry point selected based on the sensor sweep. The goal of the sweep is to identify sections with lower concentrations of life signs. Lower, not absent, because an absent life sign reading in Mortis Thuler usually means the sensors are being blocked, not that the section is clear. The hull is dense with mineral and metallurgical interference, and the warp saturation creates false negatives on virtually every sensor system deployed against it. A clean reading is not a safe reading. It is simply a reading that has not found anything yet. Once inside, the kill team moves with the knowledge that they are not merely looking for threats. They are being observed by threats that have been navigating these corridors for centuries. The Genestealer broodmind has registered the boarding party the moment their torpedo made contact with the hull, and the entire brood is now aware of their presence, their approximate location, their direction of movement. This is not paranoia. This has been confirmed repeatedly by the behavior patterns of Genestealer responses to Deathwatch boarders. The speed with which ambushes are set at optimal positions ahead of a kill team's movement, positions that require the Genestealers to have known the kill team's route before the kill team had themselves committed to it. The operational discipline required to survive inside Mortis Thuler is different from the operational discipline required in most other combat environments. The standard Space Marine approach to a close-quarters operation, aggressive, forward-moving, relying on the superior physiology and equipment of the Adeptus Astartes to overwhelm whatever opposition they encounter, needs significant modification inside the Hulk. The environment actively punishes aggression. Moving fast in the tight corridors creates noise that carries in ways you cannot control, alerting the broodmind to your position and your pace. Engaging targets of opportunity, rather than planned engagements, depletes ammunition faster than the mission's estimated consumption rates and draws more brood members to the location. Is separating to cover more ground simultaneously, a standard tactic when time is the pressing concern, creates isolated elements that the broodmind will immediately prioritize, recognizing that a single Space Marine without support is still vastly superior to a Genestealer, but that a single Space Marine surrounded by 20 Genestealers in a corridor where they can only swing a sword is in a very different situation. What the most successful Epsilon 990 missions have in common is patience. And they move deliberately. They maintain tight formations that do not leave gaps between elements for the brood to insert into. They map every junction before moving through it. They mark their routes as they go, not just for navigation, but because the Deathwatch's long experience with Mortis Thuler has produced the following uncomfortable knowledge. The Hulk's interior changes while you are inside it. Not always, not dramatically, but enough that a route that was passable on entry has, or on multiple occasions, been different on extraction. Sections have closed. New paths have opened. The internal geography shifts in ways that have never been fully explained by thermal expansion or structural settling. It shifts, and if your extraction route has shifted with it, you need the mental map of the options you noted on the way in to construct an alternative. The missions are not purely reactive, they are reconnaissance, and the specific things they are looking for have grown more sophisticated with each decade of the crusade. Early missions concentrated on mapping the outer sections and cataloging the primary threat populations. Subsequent missions have pushed deeper, taking the Deathwatch into sections that no previous mission record mentioned, into geography that appeared to not exist the last time anyone looked. The librarians who accompany these missions do work that goes beyond combat support, and they are reading the warp saturation of the sections they pass through, noting changes in the quality and intensity of the psychic background. They are comparing their current readings to the classified records of previous missions, and noting where the energies have intensified, where they have changed in character, where new concentrations have appeared in sections that were previously unremarkable. What this mapping of the invisible is as important to the Deathwatch's overall understanding of Mortis Thuler as the mapping of the physical corridors. Perhaps more important, because the invisible map is changing faster than the physical one, and it is changing in a direction. The objectives of an Epsilon 990 mission are In order of priority, first, update the map of the Hulk's current configuration. Note new accretions. Note sections that have collapsed or shifted since the last mission. Note changes in the distribution of major threat populations. Second, assess any new vessels that have been absorbed since the last mission. Identify them, if possible, and determine whether they carry anything that requires immediate action. Surviving personnel, high-value technology, potential vectors for additional threats. Third, eliminate specific threats where the opportunity presents itself and the tactical situation allows, not a full clearance operation, which has never been successfully completed and is probably not survivable, but targeted reduction of specific Genestealer concentrations or orc fortifications that represent a particular danger to the objective. Fourth, and unstated but real, come back. The standing order is only valuable if it produces information, and information only reaches the Death Watch if the people who gathered it survive to deliver it. As a kill team that goes in and does not come back has fulfilled the letter of the standing order, but none of its purpose. The hardest part of Epsilon 990 is not the entry. It is the exit, the point at which the kill team, having accomplished whatever it has accomplished, must move from the interior of Mortis Thuler back to the hull surface and to their extraction vessel before the Hulk submerges back into the warp. The greatest danger in this final phase is mistiming. A space Hulk returning to the warp does not announce itself in advance with a siren and a 10-minute warning. It announces itself with a sudden shift in the psychic pressure inside the structure, a change in the frequency and intensity of the warp energies that can be detected by the psychers of the kill team. Librarians, primarily, but also any member with even marginal psychic sensitivity. The Death Watch protocols for this phase require the librarian to maintain constant attention on this signal throughout the mission, and to begin the extraction sequence at the first sign of change, regardless of whether the mission objectives have been completed. The rule is non-negotiable. Staying to finish an objective when the Hulk is beginning to return to the warp means being trapped inside it when it goes under. And being trapped inside it when it goes under means being carried into the warp in a vessel whose Geller field equivalent is the warp energy already soaked into every surface. The Hall of Glory at Watch Fortress Eriok records the names and deeds of those who did not make it out. There are many names. Some of them belong to kill teams that were simply caught too deep in the Hulk when the transition began and could not reach the surface in time. Some belong to kill teams that made it to the surface but whose extraction vessels could not retrieve them before the warp claimed the Hulk. And some, the ones that the librarians describe with the most careful phrasing, in tones that suggest careful control of some stronger emotion, are kill teams that were in contact during the transition, that were clearly still moving toward the exit, whose signals simply stopped in a way that precluded any subsequent search. That's part 10, when the Hulk goes under, the warp transition. You have been inside for 6 hours. The mission has been extraordinary by the standards of any previous Epsilon 990 deployment. You have mapped 7 new sections, identified the remains of a vessel the Death Watch had been looking for since the Crusade's second decade, recovered 2 items of sufficient technological significance that the Mechanicus adept in your kill team has been vibrating with suppressed professional excitement for the last 3 hours. You have fought 3 Genestealer engagements and won all of them, though Brother Calix is down to 1 functioning arm and the bolter ammunition is lower than you would like. You are 90 minutes from the exit point. Then the librarian stops. He does not raise a hand. He does not speak on the Vox. He simply stops, in the middle of a corridor that was a passageway on a freighter 3,000 years ago, and turns slowly to face you, and his eyes behind his helmet's lenses are lit with something that is not reflected light. You have 12 minutes, he says. The next 12 minutes are among the most concentrated experiences of your post-human life. 12 minutes from now, Mortis Thuler will return to the warp. The return is not a gentle thing, not a space Hulk submerging into the Imperium produces a psychic event that spreads outward for hundreds of thousands of kilometers, a sudden howling displacement that sends navigators across the Jericho Reach clutching their temples that registers on astropathic networks as a noise they cannot describe, that causes Geller field generators on every vessel within range to spike briefly before stabilizing. This is the external manifestation. The internal manifestation is something else entirely. As the transition begins, as the warp currents that have been pulling at Mortis Thul's deep structure begin to drag it back under, the environment inside the hulk changes. The warp energy that has been a constant background presence for everything inside it becomes suddenly, immediately, more present. The walls start to look different, not to normal vision, not in any way that the optical sensors in your armor can capture, but different in the way that a psyker sees things differently. As the way that the Imperium's secondary reality bleeds through into primary, when the barrier between them thins, you see, in the hull plates around you, the accumulated weight of everything that has ever happened inside this vessel. You see time acting on the same surfaces simultaneously, the ships as they were, intact and functioning, and as they are now, ancient and rusted and fused. Get the entire temporal span of their existence overlaid in a way that your visual cortex was never designed to process. The sounds change. The constant background noise of the hulk's settling and creaking and mechanical processes does not stop. It intensifies, and to it is added something that cannot be described as sound in any technical sense. It is more like meaning, attempting to be heard without language. The dead who have died inside Mortis Thuler are closer during the transition. Yet the warp does not care about the distinction between past and present, and what has been soaked into the hull of this vessel during 12,000 years of continuous immersion in the Imperium is now releasing some of it, or releasing some impression of it, or simply making it available in a way that it is not available in real space. Everything that has ever ended inside Mortis Thule is briefly, incomprehensibly present. The Genestealers know the transition is coming well before it begins. They withdraw from the outer sections of the hulk during this period, moving inward, gathering in the deep places where the broodmind is strongest and the warp energy is most familiar. They do not fear the transition. They have experienced it many times, in some biological way that the Adeptus biologist has never fully characterized. The Genestealer physiology is adapted to warp exposure in a way that human physiology is not resistant to it, not immune to it, but comfortable with it in the way that deep-sea organisms are comfortable with pressures that would crush surface life. The transition for the Genestealer population is not a crisis, it is a season, a regular, expected part of their existence that they have been adapting to for as long as their lineage has been aboard this vessel. The orcs find the transition invigorating in a way that is consistent with everything else about their species. As the psychic field that all orcs generate collectively, the cumulative output of thousands of minds that think exclusively in terms of violence and mechanical enthusiasm, interacts with the warp energies of the transition in a way that amplifies it rather than being suppressed by it. During transition periods, the orc sections of Mortis Thuler get louder. The construction projects get more ambitious. The fights get more enthusiastic. Something about the thinning barrier between real space and the Imperium makes orc machinery work better, which the orcs take as endorsement and the Mechanicus takes as evidence of corruption, and both of them are probably right. The hullcasts disappear. Not permanently. They are still in the hulk, still in their sections, still alive and surviving. But during the transition, they are nowhere visible. But whatever deep biological or behavioral reflex guides their lives in the hulk tells them to be still and be quiet, and be small when the transition comes. They seal themselves into the tightest, most protected spaces they have found, inside bulkheads, in pressurized storage containers, in hollowed-out sections of hull where the material is thickest, and they wait. They make no sound. They do not move. As to the hullcasts who survive long enough to pass their knowledge to their offspring, do so because they learned, or were taught, or instinctively understood that the transition is not a time for being visible. What happens to consciousness during the transition, if you are human and unshielded, is something that survivors describe consistently enough to suggest that the description is accurate rather than individually hallucinatory. The past becomes present. Your own memories and the memories of the Hulk become difficult to distinguish. You experience events that did not happen to you. The boarding actions fought here decades and centuries ago. The deaths that occurred in corridors you are standing in. The moments of terror and courage and despair that the warp absorbed and stored and is now playing back simultaneously. You do not lose your identity, necessarily, but you share it briefly, or with the history of a structure that has 12,000 years of history to share, and then it is over. The Hulk is in the warp. The energies that were briefly overwhelming normalize into the constant background that is the Hulk's usual state. The sounds return to their usual frequencies. The walls are just walls again. The Genestealers emerge from the deep places. The orcs resume their projects. The hullcasts uncurl and move again. But if you were inside when it happened, if you were a Death Watch kill team that did not get out in time, then you are now in the warp, inside the largest space hulk in the Jericho Reach, with no indication of how long the transit will last, and every creature that calls this place home now beginning to move back outward toward your position. The Hall of Glory at Watch Fortress Eriok records the names of those who stayed too long. Their deeds are recorded there in full. Their watchfulness is noted. Their sacrifice is honored. What is not recorded there, what exists only in the classified annotations, in the sealed reports, in the private communications between the Watch Commander and the senior inquisitors of the Jericho Reach, is the question of whether any of them are still alive. A kill team caught inside during a transition has, in theory, the capacity to survive inside the Hulk through whatever transit period follows, as long as their equipment and supplies hold, and as long as they can continue to operate in an environment that is, during warp transit, noticeably more hostile than during its real space periods. The warp energies are higher. The warp entities are more active. The Genestealers, sustained by their own broodmind, are in the optimal environment for their kind. Everything that was difficult in real space becomes somewhat harder. In theory, if such a kill team survived to re-emergence, as the first signal they broadcast upon the Hulk's return to real space would be received by whatever Death Watch assets were tracking the emergence. In theory, extraction would be possible. In theory, the Death Watch has never abandoned its dead unnecessarily. In theory. Part 11. The Deeper Mystery. What is Mortis, Thuler, trying to become? There is a question that the Death Watch librarians have been asking for as long as the Death Watch has been conducting Epsilon 990 missions. As a question they have never committed to in official reports, but that appears, in various formulations, in the classified annotations. Is Mortis Thuler doing this on purpose? Not in the sense that it has a mind, or a will, or intentions that can be articulated, but in the sense that a growing thing has purposes that are expressed in its growth rather than in its thinking. A tree does not decide to grow toward the light. It grows toward the light because that is what trees do. It's because the processes that constitute a tree produce that outcome as a result of their nature. Is Mortis Thuler growing because the processes that constitute it produce that outcome as a result of their nature? And if so, what is that nature? What is the trajectory of that growth? Where is it going? The Jericho Moore Warp Gate is central to any answer the Death Watch's librarians have been willing to put on paper, even in classified form. The gate is ancient, far older than the Imperium, as possibly older than the Elder Empire, possibly among the oldest constructed objects in the known galaxy. It is a permanent, stable connection between the warp and real space, engineered to a standard that the Imperium could not remotely match, maintained by mechanisms that no Mechanicus adept has been able to fully understand despite extensive study. The fact that Mortis Thuler has never been recorded anywhere outside the Jericho Reach, and has been continuously present in the Reach for at least 12,000 years, suggests a connection to the gate that goes beyond coincidence. The connection might be simple. The gate's energies create a warp current that always draws Mortis Thuler back to the same region of space, so that every transit the Hulk makes returns it to the Jericho Reach, regardless of the direction it appeared to travel. This is the mundane explanation, and probably the one most Mechanicus adepts would prefer. The other explanation, the one that the librarians entertain in their classified annotations, the one that explains the sealed operations designated Omega Vault Decree, is less comfortable. What if the gate and the Hulk are not just incidentally connected? What if Mortis Thuler's growth, its longevity, its continuous increase in mass, its apparent anchor to a region of space where no other Hulk of comparable age has been recorded? What if all of this is because Mortis Thuler is trying to become the gate, or trying to become something the gate needs, or trying to become something that the gate was designed to connect to? The Omega Vault, located in Watch Fortress Erioch, is a sealed chamber that opens only under conditions that the Death Watch has never been able to fully predict or replicate. It opens, apparently, when the threat level in the Jericho Reach reaches certain thresholds and dispenses warnings, data, and occasionally equipment that were placed there by an earlier, different, and apparently far more foreseeing version of the Death Watch millennia ago. Several of its dispensed items have explicitly referenced Mortis Thuler. The content of those dispensations is classified beyond the clearance of even the senior watch captains. But the existence of those dispensations is known, and it tells you something about how seriously, a very long time ago, someone took this particular Hulk. The possibility space is enormous and uncomfortable, that Mortis Thuler is growing toward a size that will allow it to interact with the gate in a way that smaller vessels cannot, that the enslavers aboard it, entities native to the warp, entities that predate the current shape of the galaxy, are not incidentally present, but specifically attracted to the particular combination of warp exposure and material composition that Mortis Thuler represents. That the hive mind, wherever it is in the depths of the extragalactic void, yet has seeded its Genestealers into this specific Hulk, not just because it was convenient, but because the Hulk has a specific trajectory that will eventually bring its passengers to precisely the right place at precisely the right time for precisely the right purpose. None of these possibilities are confirmed. None of them are in the formal record. But the formal record also includes the fact that several Death Watch kill teams have been sent on missions designated Omega Vault Decree, and no one below Watch Commander rank knows what those missions found. The formal record includes the fact that the adepts of Samek, once the closest thing to genuine experts on Mortis Thuler, were classified as tech heretics, and their records were destroyed. The formal record includes the fact that every time a navigator first senses Mortis Thuler emerging from the warp, the technical word they consistently use in their personal logs, not the formal classification, not the official language, but the word they write when they are trying to describe an experience to themselves, is wrong. Not dangerous, not large, not threatening, just wrong. Part 12. The whole picture. What you take away from the dark. Mortis Thuler has been doing what it does for longer than most human civilizations have existed in any form. It has absorbed ships and organisms and history and warp energy, and it has grown, and it has returned, and it has grown more, and it has returned again. It carries within it an ecosystem of terrible sophistication, shaped by pressures that no controlled experiment could replicate, producing organisms and relationships and behaviors that exist nowhere else in the known galaxy. The Genestealers of Mortis Thuler are not the Genestealers of a fresh infestation. They are something older and deeper and more adapted. A brood that has been waiting with 12,000 years of accumulated patience, was led by something that sits in the deep places and exerts the cold weight of centuries on everything around it. When they have a host population, when the Hulk brings them close enough to seed, they do not simply infect and move on. They carry with them the particular signature of an ancient and very patient intelligence, and the cults they produce are proportionally different from the cults produced by broods that have only been waiting for decades. Yet the orcs of Mortis Thuler are not the orcs of a raid. They are the orcs of a permanent population, adapted to an environment that should have killed them several times over, engaged in a project of such optimistic ambition, the steering of a continent-sized space hulk, that you almost have to admire the stubborn creative confidence it represents. They have made Mortis Thuler, in their sections, into something approaching a home, which is more than almost any other organism aboard can say. The hullcasts of Mortis Thuler carry in their scratched ritual markings and their behavioral memory and their carefully maintained sleeping positions, something that would be moving to observe if it were not so profoundly unsettling. The last residue of being human, maintained against every environmental pressure through the sheer inertia of inherited behavior. Whatever the original crews of whatever ships they descended from were, they were people who had habits and relationships and knowledge, and some trace of that persists, passed down not as language or thought, but as ritual and reflex, through generations of mutations so severe that the creatures performing those rituals would not be recognized as human by anyone who saw them. Right, and underneath all of it, under the Genestealers and the Orcs and the Hullcasts and the Enslavers and the Kroot and the Eldar and the Warp entities and the preserved vessel of the Emperor's gaze, and whatever the Omega Vault has classified and whatever the Adepts of Samek discovered, is the structure itself, old in a way that resists description, growing in a way that resists explanation, and anchored to a place and a warp gate and a future that the Death Watch can feel the shape of without being able to fully see it. The Death Watch keeps watching it. They have to. Standing Order Epsilon 990 requires it. But even without the order, even if the Watch Commander announced tomorrow that the Standing Order was lifted and no more kill teams would be sent in, there are librarians in Watch Fortress Erioch who would find their own reasons to keep going back. But there is something in Mortis Thuler that the psychically sensitive reach toward despite themselves. Something that feels, in the way that very old things feel, like they are approaching a point they have been building toward for a very long time. And in the grim darkness of the far future, where understanding what is coming is the only advantage ever available to those who will have to face it, the value of knowing what that point is cannot be overstated. There is a broader context worth sitting with before we finish here about what Mortis Thuler means for the Jericho Reach as a whole and for the populations that live and die in its shadow. The Jericho Reach is already a region under extraordinary pressure. The Achilles Crusade, launched to reclaim the sector for the Imperium after the long isolation of the Age of Shadow, is fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously. The Orpheus Salient faces the expanding bio-horror of Hive Fleet Dagon, a tyrannid splinter fleet that has been grinding down system after system with the slow, inevitable patience of something that measures time in consumed biomass. The Acheros Salient faces the Chaos warbands that have had centuries of the Age of Shadow to entrench themselves in their fortifications. The Canis Salient faces the Tau Empire, whose expansionism in this region is driven by strategic logic rather than apocalyptic nihilism, but is no less difficult to contest. This is a war on three fronts, with one fleet, and it is going badly in ways that the Crusade's official communications do not fully convey. Into this context, Mortis Thuler re-emerges periodically. It appears in the void of the Orpheus Salient, on the same side of the Reach as the Tyrannid incursion. Every time it appears, the Death Watch boards it and confirms that the Genestealer population is still present, still growing, still waiting. Every time, the same question is asked and never quite answered. What happens when Hive Fleet Dagon's psionic vanguard reaches this region of space? What happens when the Hive Mind, grinding through the Reach system by system, extends its synaptic network to within range of the brood mind that has been waiting in Mortis Thuler for 12,000 years? The Genestealer brood aboard the Hulk will not need to find a planet to infect. They are already aboard the largest and most dangerous vehicle in the region. But they will receive the Hive Mind signal, the call that every isolated Genestealer brood receives when a fleet comes close enough, the subliminal command that sends the brood into a frenzy of activity and prepares it for the arrival. And the response they make to that signal will happen from inside Mortis Thuler, which is to say, it will happen from inside an object the size of a small moon that has been accumulating mass and warp energy for 12 millennia. An object that outmasses Bastion-class space stations. An object that dims local suns when it passes. The Death Watch's classified assessments, as much as can be inferred from what does leak through the classification layers, suggest that this scenario is being treated with the utmost seriousness. The operations logged under Omega Vault Decree are increasing in frequency. The missions to Mortis Thuler are getting longer, more specific, and more focused on the deepest sections rather than the peripheral mapping that most missions have historically concentrated on. Something has changed in how the Death Watch is approaching its oldest and most carefully maintained problem. And somewhere in the vast darkness of the void, in whatever realm awaited those who have finally laid down their burdens, or simply never managed to put them down at all, the question of Mortis Thuler remains what it has always been. Not a problem to be solved on any human timescale, but a fact of the Jericho Reach to be watched, to be monitored, to be met at the hull with whatever kill team can be assembled, and to be survived if possible and mourned if not. The Hulk drifts in the dark, carrying its thousands of lives and its 12,000 years of history, growing slowly, waiting for something that the warp has been keeping ready for a very long time. Death from beyond the horizon, the doom that awaits, Mortis Thuler, warp artifact, Aleph Omicron 002. Case remains open, monitoring continues, Epsilon 990 standing. That is what lives in the dark out there, friends. That is what waits in the biggest space hulk ever recorded in the Jericho Reach. The whole ecosystem of it, as from the Genestealer brood that has been waiting for 12,000 years, to the orcs hammering away at their impossible dream, to the hullcasts crouched in the cold and the dark, scratching shapes into hull plating, from memories they no longer know they have, all the way down to the, whatever it is, in the deepest sections, that the librarians describe with controlled unease and never quite explain. All of it inside a structure that is the size of a small moon. That has been absorbing ships and organisms in history since before the Great Crusade was a dream in the Emperor's mind. That has grown every time it has emerged and grown more every time it returned. That carries within its fused and darkened hull the compressed weight of 12,000 years of the worst that the Jericho Reach has to offer, and an unknown number of years before that which no record catches. We have gone everywhere in this video that the lore makes available to us. From the outer hull with its landscape of fused centuries, to the Genestealer deep territories, where the Broodlord waits with its accumulated patience, to the Orc warrens, blazing with stolen light to the cold sections, where the hullcasts move in their scratched ritual, dark to the enslaver zones, where the psychic pressure is so dense that even librarians in full warding feel it pushing at the edges of their minds. We have followed the Death Watch through the boarding torpedo's impact and into the corridors of something that has been waiting for people like them since before their chapter existed. We have asked the question that the Omega Vault Decree is designed to prevent anyone from asking too loudly, and we have sat with the answer that the question produces, that Mortis Thuler is not done yet. That whatever it is building toward across those 12,000 years of accretion and warp absorption and patient waiting, it is still building, still waiting, still drifting in the dark between stars, carrying its thousands of lives and its impossible history, adding to both whenever the opportunity presents itself. If you are new to the channel, this is what we do here. Deep dives into the lore of Warhammer 40,000 told slowly, told fully, told with the attention this universe deserves. We take the things the universe has built, and we walk through them properly. If that sounds like something you want more of, and if this video gave you something you were not expecting when you clicked on it, please subscribe and leave a like. It helps more than you probably realize, and it tells the algorithm that there are people out here who want the full story, not just the summary. More lore is on the way. The dark has a lot of corners, and we have not been to all of them yet. Stay in the light when you can. And when you cannot, know what is in the dark before you step into it.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.